Oh, we just have to make me the host.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Sorry.
Oh, no worries.
I forget those things. Ah.
So if I'm in presenter view like this, are you guys just seeing the slides?
You see the slides? Also have it aligned so
We're
it's.
seeing the like next slide thing.
Oh, I see. Okay, so let me fix that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Interesting.
Better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Okay, so Serena, let us know when you have the live started. We are gonna live stream this, by the way. I tell everybody, and then if you don't like it at all, we could always make it unlisted just for the participants to view later on.
Okay.
But it will be live in the meantime.
Um, did Serena left?
Maria, it seems like maybe you're being ignored.
Sorry, I'm muted. She might have gotten disconnected, so I'll just start the live. Sorry about that, guys.
I'll give Adrian a second to chew.
All right, here we go. All right, everybody, welcome to Load Bang. Thank you for tuning in to the Charlotte New Music Festival. And Andy, what do you guys have to talk about with us today?
Yeah, but it doesn't matter. It could be tonight. Who knows?
Yeah, it's whatever you want.
Yeah, so we're going to do a lecture titled The Influence of Notation.
Welcome to Load Bang. Sorry.
And so why don't we, before we dive into it, why don't we just each introduce ourselves? Because there are some familiar faces in here, but there are also plenty of people we don't know, or at least I don't know. My name's Andy Kozar. I am the trumpeter with Loadbang.
Hi, I'm Jeff Gavitt. I'm the singer in Loadbang.
Hi, William Lang. I'm the trombonist.
Hi, I'm Adrian Sandi. I'm the bass clarinetist with Loadbang.
So our plan today is to, again, give a lecture or a presentation with hopefully a bunch of questions throughout or after, titled The Influence of Notation. So, you know, as a contemporary music quartet who has, at this point, commissioned and premiered over 325 pieces, Will keeps track, so he'll tell me if our numbers are close. So, you know, we've received pieces that have utilized all sorts of different notations. Some have been very traditional, notes and rhythms, and some have been extraordinarily experimental, and then sort of everything in between. So what we're going to talk about today is a handful of pieces that have used very innovative and creative notation, but not only that, they're pieces that to us seem as like that there maybe wasn't another way actually to communicate them. Like these pieces needed to be written in this very specific way to work. So we're going to start with a piece by Evan Johnson. Evan Johnson is a composer who is currently based in the Boston area. And he wrote this for us back in 2014. This is a piece, every year Loadbang does a commissioning competition where we invite composers to submit pieces to us, and we go through a long, arduous process, pick a winner and commission that winner to write a new piece for us. So Evan wrote this piece. He won back in 2013, if my memory is correct, and we premiered this piece in 2014. Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit about the overall piece and then dive into how your particular part is notated?
Sure. So this is, if you look at the slide that's up right now, you'll see this incredible, almost like blueprint-esque proliferation of long straight lines. Evan's music for the last maybe about a decade at this point, is all handwritten in this really beautiful calligraphy. And part of the reason is that he ends up, with his musical language, building these incredibly complex rhythmic structures. You'll see the red line, the red arrow rather, pointing to my part there. It's a voice part, but you'll see it has a lot more information than you might normally see on a voice part. So on the staff, you'll see my notes, where I've just got several Ds, and then the next three notes are Ds with a little arrow, so it's like an eighth tone higher. Then we have some quarter sharps, and then there's things like mordants on that D that comes right under the 10/9. The line continuing in the middle there means gradual glissando, and the little up arrow at the end of it means that you get infinitesimally higher over that duration. So it's a complex pitch language, but it's that's one of the more traditional parts of the notation. Let's look now just above the normal staff, just above where you see the beams for those Ds. And you'll see that I have a little V in parentheses there. That's a little vibrato indication. Anything in parentheses in his notation, incidentally, means that should be sort of like barely done or kind of tossed off. Then we have mordants up above those. We have little parenthetical staccati. And then you'll notice over all that is a 10/9 tuplet. So it's incredibly rhythmically complex and super dense in terms of rhythmic information. You'll notice below the staff that I have a 15/16 that is overlapping and happening at the same time as this 10/9. So the other way that Evan deals with this rhythmic issue in his notation, I think, is really beautiful, in that the score has not only a visual sort of aesthetic appeal, but a visual utility. In this score, the 16th is, I believe, 20 millimeters on the page or something. It becomes a little more difficult once you're working on iPads and things, but as he's written them out, he's written it out so everything is exactly sort of follow the bouncing ball, wherever it lines up is wherever it should be. So in addition to this layer of extreme rhythmic specificity, layered on top of that is a kind of graphic score element, where if you were able to just follow along gradually and do the notes where they look like they happen, you would be getting it also. I once asked Evan about this actually with his solo voice piece called A General Interrupter to Ongoing Activity, which if you're interested in seeing just like the most ink per second for a solo performer of any piece ever, that probably is up there in the rankings. I asked him, well, you have all these tuplets and like 23/17 for 13, blah, 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 10 layers of things happening. I said, do you want the performer to like go graphically through it, or to like figure out a sort of base layer of tuplets and place things? And he said, actually, I just kind of let the tuplets do what they wanted this time. And, I didn't really think about what you would do, which I think is a great answer. Some people might be frustrated by that, but I think it falls under the rubric of the John Cage dictum that composing is one thing, performing is another, and listening is a third. If you look all the way up to the top of this, I have a black box with a little mordant over it. The black means my mouth is closed. When it's half black box, that means the mouth is a little open. White box means the mouth is open. And then above that, we have these beautiful, long, sort of Couperin slurs that you'll notice all over his music. In the very bottom, the text has parentheses or mordants, the performance of which is up to the interpreter. So a parenthetical Z means something like, it's a little less than saying Z. Maybe I might go instead of Zai, where I would Zai pronounce it pretty firmly as a normal vocalist. I might go Zai. And then when there's a mordant on the Z for that Zai, I might go Zai or something. Somebody else might do something else. It's a deep, deep, intense amount of information. And you'll notice one other ingredient at the very end of this first bar, I have pesante, quasi espressivo. So this E quarter flat that lasts for one tenuto 32nd, 10/9 that glisses up infinitesimally, starting quieter than PPPP, is pesante and quasi espressivo. So I think you see the overflow of information that he gives you is actually a deep resource for you to draw on.
Elizabeth, how do you want to, so just a quick question in terms of questions. Are people generally planning to just send them in a private chat to you or whoever is running it, or do we want to wait until the end to do questions?
You can take questions whenever you want. People will probably post in the chat. Are you guys able to see the chat as you're presenting?
Yeah, I can see it. So maybe we can all just, members of loadbang who are not currently speaking and presenting, why don't you hop on the chat so whoever's talking can focus on that and everyone else can get questions.
Great, perfect. So yeah, that's amazing.
Kind of like let the questions stack up if you want, and then take a time to address them as you want to. So it's totally up to you guys how you want.
Awesome, that sounds great. Adrian, you want to talk a bit about the bass clarinet part here?
Yeah. So one thing that we didn't mention beforehand about this piece is the fact that we don't play facing the audience. We face each other as the ensemble. So my back faces the audience. The piece is meant to be played as what happens, as the sound that we create for us. It's not meant to be shared. And that intimacy and the intensity is something that you can see in our individual parts. So if Andy wouldn't mind going to the next slide so people can see better what my part is about. So the beginning of the first measure, let me go here. Back here at the beginning, I have an F sharp that gradually has a glissando. This dotted line goes all the way down to this E quarter flat and E flat. This is all, 4 or 5 Ps? And mi fondo means in the background. This quasi leggero, very light, espressivo, mal sicuro means uncertain. So there's a lot of indications that we're trying to convey at a point where our sound is so fragile. It's always at the edge of breaking. And for us as woodwind players, we're always at the risk of blowing just a little bit too much, that we get a squeak, or we get a multiphonic, or we get some additional sounds. And that is something that Evan doesn't mind. It's part of what he wants, that tension. But as Jeff pointed out, we're playing 5 Ps at the edge of sound, and then he's asking for these little more dense, little injections of sound. And one very cool thing that he does, you see at the top these 3 lines. Those are for embouchure pressure. So the middle line, this is for a normal, regular embouchure. The top line means a tighter embouchure, and the bottom one means loose. So as we approach this last note with this little extra more at the top, the little bit of tightening that we produce with the embouchure, it adds that intensity that he's looking in our sound. And right here in this 8/7, he even has a marking, risk not sounding. He has this beautiful F sharp, almost air sound, the empty note heads. But he has a tremolo going down, a tremolo going up, and all of this as your embouchure goes from the medium regular embouchure to a very loose. So any concept of sustaining your sound or keeping like a beautiful sound is something that you don't throw out the window, but you have to reconsider what you're doing, because there's so many elements in not only fingering, trying to portray all these notes, but the the aperture changes, the pressure, the risk of barely sounding, it makes a beautiful, beautiful effect. I don't know what else.
Great.
Go
So
next.
yeah, let me skip ahead here. So in this next section, this is just to show, this is just to show a bit of what the entire score looks like. A lot of the piece is written in sort of these little, it's a 4-movement piece. For the most part, Jeff and Adrian play the whole time. And Will and I are used a little bit less. So we'll spend time talking about our notation in some other pieces. But this is just a little bit of what the piece looks like when we're 2D. So this is the first time all 4 of us play is maybe 25 seconds or so into the second movement. So you can see how, I think these scores are incredibly beautiful. The resultant sound is beautiful, and the way they appear on the page is it's very beautiful, but also as a performer, I think it's actually quite helpful how it looks. I think it really affects deeply how it's interpreted, or how we sort of approach it and perform it. Are there some questions or any other thoughts from loadbang guys before we play a little excerpt of this?
I just want to mention about a thought I have about dealing with notation like this. When it is so specific and clear in its density and kind of overload, I actually really like working with this kind of notation as a performer, because it means every time I come back to the piece, there's always something new, there's always something more to be looking at. And in the moment in performance, I'm required to make a lot more decisions than I am in some other music on really basic levels. Like when there's too much information for me to get everything out, I'm not just thinking like, oh, will I phrase off and be a little quiet at the end of this or whatever. I'm thinking like, all right, to get this note with this consonant thing and trilling this and my mouth half open, is it more important for me to go zzz, or more important for me to be exactly pianissimo or something? There's so many contradictions, and in a way they prioritize my involvement as a performer.
And there's one other cool thing about the brass part that we haven't gone over. The notation in the brass parts is very similar to the bass clarinet and baritone parts, except maybe a little bit more simplified. We do some things with fricatives or mouth shape while we play. But since the piece is so quiet and some of the sounds are meant to be almost unobservable, Andy and I actually play in these practice mutes. So rather than having the full trombone sound, you get a sound that's like really, really, really cut down. Whereas if you have like this, with one of these practice mutes in, and it really benefits the nature of the quietness of the piece.
Awesome, thanks, Will. Do we have any questions before we listen a bit? Anything in the chat or hands raised? I can't see anything.
I mean, I have something in the chat, but I can just say it. I was just asking, I was asking how this influences kind of rehearsal process, because I imagine you have to spend so much more time individually. You know what I mean? I was just curious, like, how that comes together differently for you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in some ways the rehearsal process is no different from any other piece. It takes more work, I think, individually up front, right? In terms of spending the time to learn it, right? Like this is quite a bit harder to learn than, notes and rhythms in a more traditional way. But, our assumption whenever we come to loadbang rehearsal is that whether it's this or whether it's like a student piece written for us by a 9-year-old through New York Phil's like Very Young Composers program we do, the idea is that like we come prepared and we rehearse it. And I think part of the way that this piece is like it's really expressive. So a lot of the initial rehearsals in a thing like this is being in the same place, right? Like making sure that we're playing this the way it should be, that the relationships between the parts are fitting. But then a lot of the rehearsal time is also spent talking about this sort of expressive elements and how phrases are passed from one another in kind of a traditional way, I think.
Yeah, our rehearsals with Evan were really about like shaping, like him saying, "Oh, this bass clarinet note that's mezzo piano is like the most important like structural element of this moment of the piece." And then we're thinking about phrases and sounds and sort of leading into that and what that means. Like for all the squiggles and lines, it's the pitches are good. That's like why this music is good, I think. It's like it's still about phrase shapes and pitch.
Anything else before we listen a bit? Okay, let's listen. So this one, as you could have gathered from us talking about it, is extraordinarily quiet. So if you have headphones, that would be awesome. And if you don't, good luck to you.
So there you have the sort of overheard quality of the piece. That is what makes it particularly difficult to record, but very exciting to perform. I also I just took the liberty of muting our co-hosts during that just to make it as quiet as possible on the stream. So don't be surprised, loadbang fellas, that I just muted you. Andy, you're muted. I muted you.
Okay, better. Thank you. I was listening, I promise. Okay, so the next piece we're going to talk about is a piece by David Franzen, an Icelandic composer who is currently living in Qatar. This is a piece called Longitudinal Study Number 1. Interestingly and totally happenstance, he also was a winner of our call or our commission competition back when we first started it. I think it was our second one he won. So he wrote us this piece that was very, very interested in, again, like this sort of very quiet sound. Jeff, do you want to talk? You talk eloquently about this piece in a way that I don't usually.
Sure. A lot of David's music has to do with what I think of as this kind of Icelandic national sound that's happening or has been happening for a while, where the elements of the Icelandic language and of the Icelandic landscape come into the music. They didn't really have pianos on the island in the 19th century, so in a lot of ways they missed out on romanticism. So I feel like this is their moment for a weird kind of 21st century musical national style or something. And what it consists of in the way that I am thinking about this isn't something David says about his music, this is my frame of it. This sort of like blasted landscape, the lava field covered in moss. And in terms of the language, Icelandic is remarkable in several senses. It has pre-aspirate consonants. So if you speak German or English, I think you probably, all of you speak English that are understanding me say this. If you say a word like toe or something, you realize that after the T, there's a big H. If you put your hand in front of you and go toe, you feel a big puff of air. In languages like Spanish or Italian, if you say like, if you said da, 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 rather than ta, there's not that puff of air. In Icelandic, that puff of air happens before some consonants. So like the name suffix that people have, meaning daughter of someone, is dóttir, dóttir. So you have a little air before. You end up with unvoiced consonants like rolled R's, like, or you can have an unvoiced N at the end of a word. So R-E-F-N as a name would be like rif. So there are these particular fuzzy, airy kind of qualities to the language. Also, when you're talking to them, instead of saying, or yep, yeah, when people are agreeing with you, Icelanders go, and it's like super disturbing. At first, you're like, oh no, did I say something shocking? So David puts all those kinds of sounds into this piece, which he's notated in this sort of super economical way where we just have the rhythm is just where something starts on the grid with the instruction for how we're supposed to do the sound, and then a thick black line to indicate that's continuing in this sort of solid state. Do we have any other slides on this, Andrew, or are we just talking about this one right here?
Sorry, we have a couple. So we'll mention like the way that it's notated in terms of the instrumental parts and also Jeff's part is basically just showing duration via the thick line. Dynamics are shown traditionally underneath. There are a couple different notations he uses. So for instance, this one right here in the trumpet is showing a traditional flutter tongue and air on a low A, so a written A. So I'm pressing down 1 and 2. Exactly where to place the note is seen right here. So it's off the triplet in that way. The trombone is notated. Trombone and trumpet are fundamentally notated in the same way for this. There's a little bit, Will has some pitches and some other stuff that happens, like these sort of big moments. He also notates a little bit later a way in which oh look, I have a trumpet right here, where sometimes we're doing air through the horn in a sort of normal way, but also, does that sound awful that close? Also taking the face, taking the instrument away from the face a little bit, which is a very slightly different color, but in a piece like this where you're only dealing with a small handful of textures or small handful of colors, those really subtle changes actually are like quite meaningful and can be are like really startling and powerful. So the next page here, one of the things I think is really interesting about this is how David deals with flexibility in time. So the piece is at essentially 100, like eighth note at 100 is sort of bass tempo. But in these moments here with the arrows, this shows this growing sort of intensity of speed. So you get just ever so slightly faster. And then when we get back into A2 here, we're relaxing back into the original tempo. So we have these sort of pushes and pulls, but instead of writing rit or colorando, it's just shown via like, those arrows can almost be interpreted as like intensity or coming back from this sort of tension. Will, do you want to talk a little bit about, because you and Adrian in these moments here have these sort of these really powerful swells that happen about halfway through the piece.
Yeah, so those swells are coordinated, usually among 2 parts, sometimes all 4 parts, to just be these really like almost oceanic swells in a way. A lot of the time, what either Adrian or I are doing are breath sounds or extremely low sounds. Like for me, there's actually a subtone pedal tone, which is an octave beneath the traditional pedal tone on the trombone. And it's more of a pressure effect than it is an absolute dynamic when we get that lower and when we just do air sounds with a flutter tongue. So in going with what Jeff said and how this kind of represents this Icelandic character, I really hear these specific moments where everybody comes together and kind of together as representing a swell in water or a swell in wind that kind of has to do with this landscape that he's set up for us.
We'll skip ahead here. One more, just so you can have a little bit more context. And those swells that Will was just talking about, this is one of those right here, where you have Will sort of starting from nothing in this kind of pedal tone area, and same thing with Adrian in this area. So you have these really incredible swells that then go back to nothing. Before we play a recording, are there questions about this specific one? Oh, Jeff.
I was just waving hi to Karen. I just answered a question in the chat.
Oh. Okay, great. So why don't we go ahead and listen to a little excerpt of this. So you get a little bit of the sort of feel of that piece. It's one of those pieces too for me that like it's interesting already, and then when it goes on and it lives in this space for how long is it, like 8 minutes or so? You almost could live there forever. Like the piece could be 3 hours and that would be just fine. Just sort of chill back into it. Awesome. So let's move on to Eve Biglarian's Island of the Sirens. Eve is I'm not sure if you all know of her music. She's an extraordinary composer, a lovely person. And Eve had been sort of, when loadbang started back in 2008, Eve had been one of those people who was on our list, like immediately we have to get a piece from her. And it took a couple years for the schedules to align, and she ended up writing us this really incredible piece called Island of the Sirens. It's for us and electronics. The way that the piece is written is in terms of notation, is interesting for this particular lecture because there is no notation in a way, which is why we picked it. For Jeff, he has notes and rhythms. For Will and Adrian and I, we have these audio scores essentially, where we have a very, very complex amount of information coming into headphones, and our job is to represent them to the audience to the best of our ability. Jeff, can you talk a little bit about the sort of background of the piece?
Sure. This is one of my favorite pieces that we have in terms of the kind of incredible complexity and richness that she's built into the conception of the piece. The origin of the piece, other than us asking her for a piece, comes from her trip down the Mississippi River. So she kayaked and mountain biked down the Mississippi as this sort of like creative pilgrimage. And on her way, she heard a flood warning siren in Louisiana. So it's literally a warning siren that was being tested, that is played to let people in a certain area know that there's a flood coming from the river. She loved the sound of it. She got a friend to come back and get a great recording of it. And then she started to cut it up with electronics, cutting it into different formant bands, slicing the siren, and then having some software transcribe it automatically via MIDI into notation, which it does incredibly poorly. If you have ever tried to do anything like that, you know this. And then she's used the sound of that siren to make altered sort of resonant audio recordings that have these siren bloops and filter sweeps in them. And also she used this bad auto-generated notation to give to a group of 8 women to sing and record. So what you hear in the speakers in the house are parts of these altered siren recordings, as well as women singing the bad computer versions of these things renotated. My part is a freely composed part that is based on a text by Rilke called The Island of the Sirens. And it's really the thing that ties the whole piece together. So we have the literal warning siren, and then we have in the text, it's Odysseus explaining what it was like to hear the song of the sirens. So he's lashed to the mast with his ears plugged up, or his men all had their ears plugged up, and he was lashed to the mast so that he could hear what the song of the sirens was that would make someone want to dash their ship against the rocks. The text is about the impossibility of explaining that experience. What is it like to hear something that makes you want to smash your boat and be killed? Like, you can't explain what that's like, you just have to experience it. So this inability to communicate comes through in the sort of bad computer versions of the siren, which are then sung and read by human people who sing it, who do another kind of interpretation, and then Eve mixes it all together. And the other 3 guys are playing parts that are just in their ears. They're audio scores that they're supposed to just interpret as exactly as they can. The problem is, well, I'll let the other guys explain what the problem is of the audio scores, and then Andy can play some. But it all fits into the metaphor of the impossibility of communication.
Yeah, before we even talk about it, I think I have this separated here into a recording of the entire piece. So you can hear what the composite sounds like, but also what the audio tracks sound like. So why don't we listen to like 30 seconds or 45 seconds or so of one of the audio tracks, and then we can talk about the difficulty of playing that on trumpet or trombone or bass clarinet, though I feel like it'll probably be fairly obvious. So you get a little bit of an idea of what these audio tracks are that are in our ears. So we actually have to do our best to approximate those and to use extended techniques and use all sorts of, on trumpet, I end up using a lot of plunger mute and half valves and sometimes singing through the instrument, and ways to approximate those sounds, knowing that I will always fail, right? Like it will never actually sound like what I'm hearing.
But at the same time, I think it's important to note that the task is in the trying, right? The task is not perfectly reproduce this or you are failing. The task is desperately try to communicate.
Which means it's often, that aspect of it makes it also not demoralizing, right? The idea that like, I'm doing my best to try to make this thing, and I know that it's not going to be exactly what it is because I'm not a computer. And that's kind of fun, right? That trying to communicate, knowing that I can't, and that's inherent, is a fun part of the process. Whereas sometimes you get pieces where the nature of it is that it's too hard and it's impossible, and then you just feel bad about yourself for not being able to do it. Will, Adrian, do you want to talk about that at all, or your sort of experience with the piece?
No, one of the beautiful things is how every single time we perform it, you have a totally different experience with it. The attempt to execute on the bass such high notes, all those very long glissandos that are going up or down, I find myself that every time it's a little frustrating not to recreate exactly what you're hearing, but it is so much fun to try. And every single time you play it, you find new ways of getting closer or being a little more accurate, whatever that means.
Oops, sorry. Will?
Of the piece.
There we go.
Oh, yep. I love the fact that the imperfection of it is built into the narrative of the piece, that we are trying to explain something that's inexplainable by trying to realize and play something that's unplayable. Those direct connections between the genesis of thought in the piece and the end result or the end experience of performing it really make it feel super worthwhile, and that what we do has meaning.
Awesome. Do you have any questions?
We've been answering things as they go in the chat, but yeah, if anyone has anything else, drop it in the chat and we'll talk.
Yeah, great. So let's listen to a few minutes of of everything coming together. So that's the last few minutes of that piece. The next one we're going to talk about is a piece by Mark Applebaum. Mark is another composer who was sort of on our early loadbang bucket list composers that we were sort of dying to work with. The group started when we were all at Manhattan School in their new music program, and for I think it was probably in the first year, one of the ensembles in residence was a group called Meridian Arts Ensemble, which was a brass quintet and percussion ensemble who did a ton of really incredible commissioning, and they performed a recital with Mark. And his sort of spirit and music is so infectious and exciting that back in, I think, probably 2008, right when we started, we asked him, and he said he was interested, and we got to wait for the right time. And then 2016 happened and that was the right time. So we got a really incredible piece that Mark wrote between 2016 and 2017 called Administocracy. It's a multi-movement piece. He speaks of it as in a like music -1 configuration. So there are a few sections where we all play, it's totally notated. But the majority of the piece, and those are sort of the introduction and the finale, and then the rest of the piece is made up of these improvised solos with different organizations of like rhythm section in a way, in the way that you would think of music -1, though it of course doesn't sound anything like that. Jeff, do you want to talk a little bit about the Henry Louis Gates and the ideas regarding like formal innovation?
Sure. So there's a line that Mark uses in the preface to this piece that I'm just going to pull up to read because he's like already paraphrasing. So I'm not going to paraphrase a paraphrase. Speaking of the impossibility of communication, we'll just go one set here. He says, it follows an idea expressed by Henry Louis Gates, albeit about literature. To paraphrase in admittedly crude and reductionist manner, historically speaking, the be-all, end-all of European creative genius privileges formal invention, whereas African-American aesthetics values particularized signifying over a formulaic archetype, for example, 12-bar blues, in order to express individuality while also maintaining continuity of community. This piece attempts to short-circuit that duality. It exhibits a Eurocentric allegiance insofar as the forms are weird, unique, idiosyncratic, unpredictable, but at the same time, the featured player can blow on top of these forms, a personalized expression that extends beyond that of conventional concert music interpretation. And this comes from Mark's background because he's a tremendous jazz player, but he also writes this extraordinarily complexly notated, truly weird music. He has a great piece for string quartet that Jack has done a great video of called Darmstadt Kindergarten. And I think that really that phrase sums up his aesthetic and his, and his general vibe.
Awesome. He also, Jeff, since do you have the PDF of the piece up?
Yes.
He gives these, so we have a lot of opportunities to improvise. So we each get basically 2 solo sections throughout the piece. And he never tells us explicitly how to improvise, but he does lay out what he calls these binary contradictions that are, to me, equal parts very informative and helpful, and also very, very funny. And help to make sure that we're being thoughtful of how we're improvising and how what we're doing connects to either other aspects of the piece or connects to our other improvisations. Jeff, can you read a few of those?
Sure. Do you have any that you're going to pull up, or I should just read them?
Oh, sorry. If you have them, just read them.
Great. So how does the successful player make sense of this? Perhaps it's worth considering the following binaries, each side preposterous in its ideological intensity, and yet attractive precisely because of its forcefulness. A, the composed trio passages are expressively saturated. They are interesting by themselves, nothing needs adding. In fact, these trios are diminished and burdened by additional sound. As such, the soloist needs only restraint or the ability to play beautiful silences. B, the composed trio passages are, alone, expressively impoverished. They are in desperate need of redemption by the imposition of clever, inventive, forcefully creative, and sonically majestic sonic stimuli. As such, the soloist needs to save this piece, not with the missing ingredient, but with the main ingredient. So there's one contradiction. I'll give you another one. Virtuosity means louder, faster, higher. That's A. B, there are many other virtues, restraint, lyricism, patience, inquisitiveness, etc. And then at the end, he gives meta-binary considerations, or meta-considerations about binaries. 1, do A. 2, no, do B. 3, split the difference, find the midpoint between A and B, the perfect blend of A and B. And he goes through all these different possibilities of how to relate between these extremes. And then the final option, number 7, is zucchini. That is, there's a very different way of conceiving this, and that's where he leaves us.
So the notation, in terms of specifically notation, since that's what we're talking about here, he, a lot of his notation is very consistent over his body of work. He also does, I don't want to say everything because I'm sure there's an exception somewhere, but I've never seen a piece of his that's not handwritten in his really beautiful calligraphy. The notation here is traditional in some ways in that, like, there's notes and rhythms. Mark often uses these really sort of extensive groupings of grace notes that you end up seeing that are very, very funny because they exist under, they're supposed to happen just before this note here, but there's also 4 notes to get in kind of as fast as possible. So the nature of it is that it's like sort of frantic and uncontrolled, and you just try to get everything in as fast as possible. I appreciate personally the way he deals with grace notes, like here, for instance, because he could have written that out in a very painstaking way and maybe made that like a 64th note into some sort of hellish dotted thing. But the idea with him is that it's this kind of, there's this instability in the music, and it's already hard enough, so it doesn't need to be, it's heavily notated, but to me, it doesn't feel over notated in that way. Will, Adrian, do you guys want to speak about your individual parts at all here?
Sure. Well, in particular, just the notation is exactly what you said. It looks pretty heavily notated, but I think the more interesting thing about it is how it comes back later on in the piece and future movements, because we don't just play these notes and these rhythms as written, we also interpret the same rhythms on a slightly different instrument that I think we'll get to.
Yeah. So in each of these sections, so this is exactly what Will was talking about. So here you notice this is the part, this is the set of changes that Jeff is improvising over. When his solo comes back, the form has stayed the same, and that it's the same number of measures, same number of beats, and actually 100% same rhythmic content. So I think that ties in nicely to the idea of Henry Louis Gates, where you're improvising over, the form is not changing. The form is essentially staying the same. What is changing is the improvisation sort of over a similar form. And the continuity also of what we're doing. So you notice the trumpet part, if you just scan across and just check out the rhythmic content of this, you'll notice that it's the same as the rhythmic content of these measures. It's exactly the same rhythms. The thing that is different, however, is the second time this thing comes back, we're all playing these Foley instruments. So we had to build these instruments. It's just a slab of wood, essentially, that has a couple of bells on it, a comb that we scrape, like a hair comb. It has a doorstop, one of the old doorstops on a spring, and has sandpaper. So we're rubbing different sandpaper. If you're not familiar with the Foley setups or the Foley instruments, this was a way that sound effects were made in movies. So film studios would have these pretty elaborate sort of sound booths with, there would be one little section that would have pebbles in it. So you would record people walking on it. You'd be able to record
It's
sound.
Still done.
Are they still doing it that way?
Absolutely, yes.
Wild. So you'll see here, we're using percussion notation. So it took a second to sort of wrap our heads around, at least for me, to wrap my head around, like, okay, this now is doorstop, doing the same things that percussionists have to do daily. And you have doorstops up here, lower sandpaper sound, higher sandpaper sound. You have the lower bell pitched, whichever one is pitched lower. You have the higher bell, the dash through it is, you hit the bell and stop it immediately so it doesn't vibrate. Oh, amazing. Will, can you play it just a little bit? So it's completely notated, but those are the instruments we're playing The next section here is whenever Will has his trombone solo. The bass clarinetist acts as essentially like my mute helper. And Jeff and I have this sort of duet where we're playing together, and Jeff has these nonsense words that Mark has organized very deliberately. I believe they're serialized, right? He has like a very, very thoughtful, formal way of dealing with which words happen in which
With
way.
everything.
Right.
The whole thing is very fussy like that.
And so Jeff and I are playing together. I have all of these modifications to notes. So this is a very short chromatic run down prior to reaching the C. This is like a sort of valveless or a smear. This is a doit. But each time you see this arrow here, Adrian is standing next to me, which is normally how we set up as load bank, and he's handing me these mutes. So he's just handing them off very, very quickly so I can play the next section, which is equal parts helpful and causes problems and is fun, right? Because it's happening so quickly, the likelihood of a mute getting tossed across the stage accidentally is fairly high. The likelihood that Adrian hands me a roll of duct tape instead of a mute, and that's just, I have no control over what mute. I put what in the bell, whatever it is that is handed to me. And all the while, Will is improvising over top of this. In the trumpet solos, Jeff, can you talk about the notation, your notation there, and then Will, can you chat about some of the hand signs?
Sure. So he has these groupings of sounds that I have to execute at this portion of the piece, not quite as fast as humanly possible, but later on in the piece, it pushes the boundaries of it. So going from left to right, these note heads are. Are you hearing me okay? I turned on original sound, so hopefully you won't lose these.
And simultaneously with those sounds, in fact, every 2 sounds that Jeff does, Adrian and I are doing hand gestures. So mine is, tea party, bus stop, karate chop, lighter, saw wood, scissor cut, and lotus position.
Yeah, so it ends up being this like visually very stimulating thing. And again, in the same way that we talked about Mark being like very purposeful and deliberate and fussy about these details, it's the same thing. So he's taking these like very, very complicated ways of organizing which thing happens when. But there's a very clear sort of sense of humor and self-awareness of what certain aspects of writing music like that are. He juggles these things in a way that I think is really very brilliant, very uniquely his, and I think very hard for anybody else to pull off in a meaningful way.
Humor in music is really difficult to pull off. Mark has a real grasp of how to do it in a way that's not pandering or that actually is funny.
Right. It's funny in a serious way.
Yeah.
So in terms of the way that he notates or how he communicates, things like the hand symbols, for instance, Mark has developed a whole sort of language or a whole vocabulary of these hand sounds that he uses, or hand sounds, these hand motions, these physical motions that he uses, not only in our piece, but he uses in Darmstadt Kindergarten. He uses also in aphasia and a lot of his recent works that involve movement. So you'll see there's the list of the movements that each of the players has to use, and then he gives descriptions of them. When we had the opportunity to work with Mark on this piece before we did the premiere, it was funny that it was like in the same way working with Evan on his piece. You're not exactly sure what the things are you're going to work on in a rehearsal on it, or what the things are going to be most important. And so where with Evan, it was ideas of sort of expressive qualities and connecting phrases and shaping phrases. With Mark, he was really interested in these movements and the sharpness of the movements and how they move from one thing to another. And I think we spent more time working on how we're stepping from one place to another than some of the playing stuff, because those things are seen as equally important. They're integral parts of the piece. So they get as much work as making sure that the sort of offhand triad is in tune or something. So those are just some more of the descriptions. In the bass clarinet solos, he has Jeff, Will, and I moving. So this is a movement map, a stage map. And then here he actually shows us how what we're doing. So for Will, he's moving 30 steps, and he is stepping every 2 2/3 seconds, which is something that you have to practice to get kind of used to what that means, because we're not on click or anything. We just have to do it. I have 16 steps at 5 seconds each. Jeff has 20 steps at 4 seconds each. And what that means is if we do it right, we all arrive at the last movement back in our places at exactly the same time. And if we don't, we don't. So the next page, he has just another way of notating that. So he actually, in a very helpful way, notates this particular section of the piece in 3 different ways to clarify exactly what he wants. So this page here shows us sort of linearly or horizontally how these movements would happen, how the steps and the sounds that we're making, which are either single or double bird call articulations on these little Autobahn bird calls, or whenever this section comes back, there's a duct tape element too, which are the X's here. So this is sort of written out in a more traditional way, showing us this sound happens at 8 seconds, or this happens at, because you can see for Will's are not exactly on the second mark. So it shows us both exactly where to play it, but then as we're rehearsing it, this is a really helpful tool because it shows us how our parts should be lining up, or the counterpoint of these sounds, how everything should be fitting together in the composite. And then he shows us, again, another way of notating this. So showing each of our individual movements now in addition to the sounds that we're making. So putting all of those pieces together.
And Andy,
yeah.
I don't know if you have one slide, but I think it's worth noting that all of that information is in one single page.
Right.
So it's easier to follow, the previous slide you had with the sounds and every indication you have, and the steps and the map that everyone has to follow.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Do you guys have, any of the loadbang guys have anything they want to add?
Yeah, just a couple of things that we did with Mark when we were rehearsing. This is what we rehearsed. We rehearsed walking quite a bit, like the theatrical element of the movement. Getting like the specificity of that was very important to him. I also talked with him about making this score and how he figured out how to communicate, especially the choreographic and musical elements of the piece. And he said that it took him a couple months to figure out how to notate that piece, even though he knew what it should be, knew what it should sound like, knew what it should look like. He said it took him more than a month of just working on how to get that down on paper. So he's not just having an idea and throwing down the first thing. He's like making sure this is unmistakably what he wants to communicate when it's something that is strange or new or unfamiliar.
And I think that's an important thing to note too, because when we received it, it's complicated. There's a lot of information to ingest, but it all works. All of the steps work, all of the muting, like it's so painstakingly thought through that when the score is presented to us as the performers, especially when we're having to do something that's very, very difficult, the fact that it was clear, it just cut out, we didn't have to spend time like asking him to translate what he wants or what he means, because it's all spelled out very clearly. And
then in rehearsal, we're not saying, where am I walking? What am I doing? We're saying, stare forward blankly and lift your knee higher as you walk. And like we're doing fussy details in rehearsal, which is what rehearsals are for with a composer ideally.
Right. So we'll listen. The piece is about 20 minutes long. We will obviously not listen to the whole thing. Can everybody see the screen, the YouTube screen? Is that right? Okay, great. So we'll start at the top and then I'll skip around so you can just get a feel for the overall thing.
An inchoate opening. A heroic aspiration. A titillating sound. Accompanied by irregular articulations. Some contrapuntal nonsense that sounds cool. Extended techniques. A pretty chord. Another pretty chord. An ugly chord. Pretty ugly chord. Passages from L'Histoire du Soldat, A Survivor from Warsaw, and Peter and the Wolf performed simultaneously.
This fiddle is mine, and the book is yours.
So fast.
There, each to his own, and so we're all square.
That contrapuntal nonsense played backwards. Some airy noises, followed by my solo. Up. Out. Finally, popping noises. Glissando.
What about us?
Yeah, with a trill. A pretty chord. A written request. Some exciting fast stuff. Played even faster. A crossfade. More popping. A fake ending. The real ending, lovingly performed, if expressively underwhelming.
So that is Mark Applebaum's piece. Questions before we move on? No, great. Let me get the PowerPoint going here again. Okay. So the next piece we're going to talk about, let me get this. Sorry. Oh no. Okay. Jeff or Will, can one of you guys just speak a little bit about Joanne's piece? Or maybe Jeff, can you actually talk about, can you pronounce it? Because I can never pronounce the piece title correctly. And talk a little bit about the text, and then we'll dive in and deal with.
Yeah, so it's a text in medieval Catalan that Joan has assembled from various poems by one poet. He sort of made this composite text. It's Per se plegat de te dulce ferida and the piece is by Joan Arnau Pamius. You want me to just pronounce it and then someone else talks?
Do you have the text up? We can talk a little bit about the text. One of the interesting things about this piece is that in the same way in Evan's piece, where Will and I aren't used to the same extent as Adrian and Jeff gets similar treatment in this one. So Jeff is we have the instrumental parts we'll show you here in a second, and Jeff has just these little sort of bird peep things that happen, but the text is very cool.
Yeah, so it's Ausias Mark is the poet, and the text is from 4 different poems, and it means, I go over snow barefoot, head naked, running over bad weather, endangered in the sea. There is no rest for whomever keeps another purpose, to be plagued by your sweet wound. So it's sort of medieval troubadour, romantic love kind of thing.
So the way that Joanne notates this, I think, is very, very interesting. Goes back and forth between this sort of deconstructed tablature notation that we'll each speak about what it means in terms of our instruments, but goes back and forth between that and these tiny little sort of traditionally notated sections. Adrian, can you talk about the bass clarinet writing?
Yeah, this is something similar to the first piece we talked about, Evan Johnson's. Had the top, where's here. This section for me relates to the amount of pressure that I will use on the embouchure. And one really cool thing about these little sections is that when you're asking us to play multiphonics are very sensitive to embouchure pressure, the speed of the air, the amount of air that we're using. So that can be very unstable to begin with. And then he's adding another layer of distortion. So if one as a bass clarinetist is attempting to play this multiphonic, first you have to figure out all these many variables, and he's adding something else that the will immediately distract and distort the sound. And do you have the next measure by any chance, Andy?
We'll
No.
I can skip ahead. Yeah.
Don't worry. Yeah. So we go back and forth between with these two layers of multiphonics and amateur changes to somewhat more regular playing, where we have these like short, very whisper-like notated gestures.
Awesome. Thank you. So in the, did I skip trombone? No, okay. In the trumpet part, the top up here is about volume, essentially. So the thicker the line, the greater volume that I'll be playing with. Similarly, also to Evan Johnson's piece, Will and I are both in practice mutes on this, and halfway through switch to a different practice mute for a slightly different color, but the same idea and the same purpose. This notation here that looks like a flutter tongue is exactly what that is. That's a flutter tongue. And then where it appears vertically is general register. So starting at the beginning here, it's fairly high, not the highest, but it's also like a sort of mezzo dynamic there, because you'll see there are dynamics that are much thinner, thinner moving forward. These lines here are indications of which valves to press down and how much. So this is the first valve, second valve, third valve. So when I start the piece, I start with both 1 and 3 down, and then 2 comes up and down. There are also a few sections in the piece where this line is thinner, or sort of shows like a crescendo, which is showing a sort of half valving. And then these lines here are showing the first slide. So the slide that's attached to the first valve, which would be this one here, and then the bottom line is showing the third valve, the third slide, and whether the slides are in or out, and the way that they move. So you can see how they're moving across each other here. So one is starting in, one is starting out, and moving like this throughout the first measure. So here's the trombone part.
Yeah, the trombone part is separated into 3 main staves of information. The top stave, like the trumpet part, is the register. It goes from high to low, from your most extreme high register to your most extreme low register. The thickness of the line indicates dynamics once again, and the 3 lines, tremolo, flutter tongue, is, like Andy said, a flutter tongue. The second set of lines, I just tried to put up my hand to show something and I realized that wasn't going to work. There's like 3 line staff, yeah, right where the cursor is right there. That is notation for the F trigger on the trombone, or this thumb trigger here. So as the line goes from top to bottom, that means you gradually engage the F trigger, which modifies the sound similar to the way that a valve acts on the trumpet, but also it's a little bit larger and, you know, not meant to be activated slowly. So it does a little bit different things. One other cool thing about this piece is that the F attachment is also pulled. You'll actually hear this in a second. And you play through 2 ports of the trombone. So when you take out the F attachment and you leave it halfway in, the sound, rather than coming out of the bell, will come out of the F attachment. So we have out of the bell, and then with the F attachment halfway on, and I hope that reads a little bit. So that gradual transition that you see in the first bar would sound like, and then at the bottom part of the staff, we have 1 more line indication with the Roman numerals 3 and 5. Those are indications for slide position in Joanne's note, in Joanne's way of writing in his tablature. What he's telling you is a graphic representation of move the slide in that general between those positions, kind of follow the line, as it were.
Awesome. So here is sort of blown out the whole score so we can see what some of this looks like. One of the things that I think is very interesting, let me make sure I'm going in order. No, Adrian, can you talk about what is notated in your part, and then I'll skip to the brass thing.
So as I mentioned before, the top one relates to the amount of pressure. So as the line goes up, it means I could easily take more mouthpiece or bite a little tighter. So the sound, it's one thing that it will do is prevent you from playing that multiphonic that you're always trying to play. So it's this constant struggle of trying to figure something and expecting to get that, but the changes of pressure with our embouchure will take your sound in many different directions. Those are the two things that I have, right?
Yeah.
So
you can see it a little bit blown up there. In the trombone and trumpet part, I think he does this really interesting thing where you'll see how we have, as we're moving through time, these things aren't notated in a way that necessarily facilitates playing exactly at certain times, right? You're sort of dealing with them like spatial relationships. But if you look at what's happening in the trombone and the trumpet part, you'll notice that we have the same movement at the same times, but are inverted. So though the nature of the notation doesn't necessarily show that that's the most important thing to him, he would have notated it separately if there was like a very clear wanting for things to move exactly the same way. There is something to try to hold on to as we're moving through this, in terms of not only are we trying to do all of this stuff, but Will and I also know that we should be moving basically at the same time with it, which to me is a really interesting sort of thing placed on top of this. You can see what that looks like blown up there. Now here is one of the parts we talked about, we all alluded to, where we have these little snippets of traditionally notated little bits of information or little bits of music. So the fact that mine are all half note heads, or sort of they're a diamond note head with half, means that it's basically like ghosted, or they're sort of, I think he writes it as half note, half air, which isn't totally a thing. It's just kind of like a ghosted note. In the other parts, you'll notice that some of the notes are filled in, so those should be traditionally played. Will has a C sharp at quadruple piano, but then going back and forth between these sort of half notes or half sound notes, sort of ghosted notes or traditionally played notes. And considering that so much of the music, because of the way it's notated, has this kind of smeary texture, when we get to these little moments, they really stick out, I think, in a very effective way, because suddenly, albeit for a very short time, everything locks in and is suddenly together, and then it veers off again back to this old way of playing.
There also there's a relationship between some of the sounds that happen in each kind of notation, or one player, as you have here, will be in tablature notation and one player will be playing traditionally. I think the piece does a good job of not always being didactic about the shifts between them, but creating an environment where you're kind of not sure if it was like what is the player communicating out of the score? Is this quasi improvisatorily shaped like your register and tablature things, going between here's the sound I want, do whatever you need to do to make it, and here's what I want you to do, whatever sound it makes is fine. And I think that interstices and sort of borders of that are what's most interesting and important about the piece.
So we'll play just a little excerpt of this one so you get an idea of it. So that's about the first half of that one. So the last piece we're going to talk about is a piece. Oh, are there any questions about that before we move on?
Yes, I have one, and it's actually not even, though maybe you should wait until later. It's not specific to that particular piece.
If you're thinking, we have time. So if you're thinking it,
basically, my apologies if this sounds like a stupid question, but I noticed that like you title your presentation "The Influence of Notation," and I'm wondering what specifically is being influenced by the notation. Is it you as a group? Is it how you search for music? How you go about preparing the music? Is it something to do with your philosophy?
Yeah, no, that's not a stupid question at all.
Yeah, I think the performance practice, the way we rehearse, the way the piece sounds, all those things are influenced by the notation. Our interpretations, our questions, our things that we sort of take for granted when we're working on a piece can be questioned by a different kind of notation. So I think by the influence of notation, we're trying to say that it matters how you write these things out, or how one writes these things out or doesn't write them out, and that it's going to have a big impact on the performance and the sound of the piece. So how performers and audience members experience it. So we gave some examples of pieces that do things in non-traditional ways, in ways that we think are successful, in that they take an idea that is off the beaten path, but specific and clear and does a thing, right? It influences the way that the piece comes off in some way that we find effective.
Does that clarify?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Awesome. So let's do the last piece, and then we can sort of open it up for general questions as they come up. Will, you want to talk about Paula's?
Yeah, so Paula let me see if I'm muted. Nope, not muted. Paula Matheson's piece, Old Fires Catch Old Buildings, had a really interesting start to it. Whereas a lot of the times we commission composers, we just kind of get notes on a page and I was like, here's the piece, now play it. Paula actually sent us a lot of different material to record for her. And she didn't care about the fidelity of the recording or anything like that. She just wanted to hear what all these like sounds would be. And so we all took our sounds and we recorded them and sent them back in the Paula, and she ended up crafting these cassette tape parts out of them. So the piece is played for four performers and 4 cassette players that are different recordings of the sounds that we sent her that were also used as material in the piece. So we're kind of playing as like a quartet plus ghost quartet at the same exact time throughout this piece. So that's the first really interesting thing about this. Notationally, Paula separates the piece into minutes and then puts our material graphically within those minutes. So if you see, I think that's minutes 5, 6, 7, and 8, and that looks like the trumpet part.
This is the section where it's by 30 seconds. This section is by 30 seconds.
It's a little hard for me to read this. Yeah, so each line is actually 30 seconds long, and we play the material graphically within those sections, unless there's 2 separate boxes with an arrow between, in which case we go back and forth them as we choose for the duration of the solid line that you'll see at the end of some sections or at some notes.
Yeah, there are very few parts that explicitly line up. But the way that Paula deals with that, it basically is just by putting a number marking here. So, for instance, it's 7:05. Jeff and I have a thing together. So, we all start stopwatches at the same time, but then also give sort of visual cues just to make sure, there can be little discrepancies when we're all starting a stopwatch. Another interesting component, I think, of this piece that is separate from the notation of it is that cassette tapes are very, they're tricky, right? They change with the weather, they change with the heat. If it was a particularly bumpy and frigid airplane ride for a cassette tape, when you land, like when we land in London with these things, they might sound different than they did whenever we started off in New York. And part of that is a part of the piece, right? The fact that she's dealing with analog technology with these, but she's also dealing with the digital too. So we have a fixed media part that's playing through speakers that's always the same. We have this tape part that is mostly about the same, and we embrace the jankiness of it until it just gets so busted she has to make a new set of cassette tapes. So the piece ends up kind of morphing. It always stays the same piece. It's always recognizable, I think, as the same piece, but there are, it moves, it sort of evolves and moves around a little bit in a way that I think is very interesting, and is an aspect of a lot of her music to varying degrees. Let me pull up the YouTube link here. Are there questions about this one before we watch some of the video?
I thought I could mention if we look back at the score for a second, just we didn't talk about the temporal flexibility in the notation. I thought we could explain that a little bit.
Great. Let me switch back to that. Okay. Cool. Can you see it?
Yeah. Yeah. So if we look at the first page of the slideshow, and then all the following pages of the slideshow very quickly, and then Paula's piece, we'll see that in addition to the time frames that she gives, you'll see in the top system there's a repeat and a box and a solid line going after it. So if you look at the spacing, you think, okay, maybe that's 7 seconds into the line or something. We start playing a G glistening down to an F3/4 sharp, or F waffle tone, as our friend Dan Peck describes those accidentals, up to G, and then a solid line after that. And what that means is that you repeat that gesture for that duration. And then on the next system, we have that F sharp glistening up to G, and then that's in a box with a repeat, and then there's arrows going back and forth between the next box, and that then align to the end of the system. What that indicates is that you freely move between those two boxes throughout 6 to 6:30. So we have a box, and then we have moving between boxes, and we don't have an example of it here, but if, for example, on the second system between the first and second box, there was a right pointing arrow rather than the two-headed arrow, it would mean you should gradually move from one box to the other by replacing repeats gradually more and more and more, such that you move from repeating 1, maybe 5 times, the other one is once, and then 4 times, and it's 2 and 3 and 3, or however you do, gradually moving from one to the other. So there's big consistency in terms of time structures, but wobbly detail.
Awesome. Great. So let's move over to the video here. that is what we have in terms of slides and presentation-y things. We have, what do we got? 18 minutes. So are there questions? Anybody have some things they want to chat about or want to interrogate more in terms of specific pieces or just sort of general load bangy things? I hear furious typing, but I don't know what that means.
I just realized I'm not muted, but I have a quick question.
Great.
Well, I wasn't typing at the time, but I think I might have been tapping on my desk. So I was wondering how you decided on your name of loadbang, if you don't mind me asking.
No, not at all. Will, you want to talk about power concerts briefly, because this is part of our next talk, so we don't want to give it all away now.
Yeah, back we met when we were all in school together at Manhattan School of Music. We were in the flagship year of their contemporary performance program. They put us in an old abandoned library, and Andy and I decided to use it as a place to give concerts. So we gave 20-minute concerts every Tuesday night at 10 p.m. And eventually our group formed on an April Fool's Day concert. And after playing a few shows together, we talked about names, and we had a couple of different options, but we decided to go with loadbang, which is a term from Max MSP, the computer program. What it is, it's an object that you put in a computer patch, and when you load the program, it sends a signal or a bang out and triggers something like an audio file to instantly happen.
Yeah, so we just thought it sounded cool, so we went with it, and here we are, 11 years later.
Yada, yada, yada. Here we
Yada,
are.
yada, yada. Here
12
we are.
years.
12, oh, excuse me. Awesome. Anything else? Cool. So our next talk is at 4:30. So Elizabeth, if you want, we can just sort of stop now and have an extra 15 minutes.
I actually have a question that might be helpful for this crew. What do you recommend in terms of notation? What are some of the, what are some of the most difficult things you've come across in composers' works that they give to you and hope you can interpret?
In terms of like most difficult to interpret or most difficult to like, not the hardest to play, but the hardest to understand?
Or decipher.
I have a answer.
What makes it easier? What makes it difficult, you know?
Yeah.
Oh, I think personally, one of the hardest things I've noticed is when a younger composer takes somebody else's system, like notational system that's non-traditional, and just kind of uses it exactly or uses it slightly askew. It can result in a lot of questions coming up, and there's always this idea that when you take something very complex and you just try to lift it wholesale and use it for something else, sometimes things get lost in the shuffle, or the intent behind it can become harder to interpret than when it's from its original source. I think maybe if somebody can expound upon that, I know there's more here that I'm not saying, but that's one of the biggest things I've noticed. Like if you just decided to suddenly start writing in Joan Pamish style because you saw that one piece, it's really hard to recreate whole cloth from the exposure to it. And I feel like Jeff might have something to add on to that.
Sure. Yeah. It's part of, I think, the sort of Venn diagram issue, overlap issue that I would put with that is that it's a subspecies or a cousin of the like, or maybe it's an inverse of like reinventing the wheel. Like where the point of of notation is communication. We're trying to get something to the performer to have them understand something about what they should do. So if there is a way that exists already for you to do it, that's an awesome place to start. But also I think what Will's talking about is more like an entire kind of notational gestalt, or like a way of communicating in its entirety rather than like specific notational detail. I think that's an interesting distinction because, for example, as a singer, I'll get people writing phonetic things in 1,000 different ways. When, as a conservatory singer, I learned the International Phonetic Alphabet, which as a system can communicate pretty much any language sound that you would want to make. Literally every language sound that is used by a language in the world can be contained within this system. So if someone wants to say, oh, but I like this other way of communicating something with language, that means I have to learn a whole new thing. You're making up a whole new thing. You're probably not as good at language as the people who made up IPA over the last 60 years, who's like an international team of linguists and things. It's like, it has its problems. It's super Eurocentric in terms of its bias in the symbols, but it is very comprehensive. So if there's a way to do it that exists already, do it. But if you're taking a whole thing, you need to think about what comes with that thing. Why is the composer using that whole system? What are they interested in getting? For example, if you grab a whole system that's about, for example, we're talking about Juans. If you grab a whole tablature system, but you actually want specific notes and rhythms, or you want like a very particular thing, it's like, well, the whole tablature system's maybe not the best direction for that, right? So yeah, I'm babbling. But
yeah, no, it's a difficult thing, right? I guess like from our perspective, or at least from my perspective, is like I'm more than happy to work in either like experimental or like modified music notation, right? We do a lot of that with our lives, but there are certain times when we'll receive a piece and it's very clear that this could have been notated using notes and rhythms in Sibelius or whatever, and we would have gotten the same result but gotten to it faster, which is I think is something to be thoughtful about as a composer, is that and we all write, right? Like everybody in loadbang also writes music, so this is a thing we're also thinking about, like not from the perspective only of like what am I playing and why and how, but also what am I writing for other people and why and how. But just the nature of the world we live in and the sort of musical world we live in, both in terms of time and finance. Like time is money, and so time, like money, are both limited, right? So when we get a new piece, if we get a new piece like Evan Johnson's and we have all the time in the world to work on it and learn it, which we did in that time, because we asked him specifically for a piece, knowing what it was we were going to get and planned accordingly so that we could really do a good job on it. That's great. But, if you have the sort of normal 4 to 5 rehearsals, and that's not normal. Usually it's probably like 2 to 3 or some garbage, right? Which is not enough. But even with 4 to 5 rehearsals, if we have to spend, we as loadbang or any ensemble anywhere or any orchestra have to spend extra time decoding, right? Or trying to translate, and then come to find that it was just a whole note all along. It was just an F sharp whole note. That's just a lot of time that we weren't able to spend like actually rehearsing and making sort of music out of the thing. So I think for me, a lot of it, and again, I'm rambling, and so I'll stop. But it's about sort of finding the balance of like, what is it notationally that your piece really needs, right? I can't imagine Evan's piece being any different from that. And that's part of what makes it sort of so fun. But not every piece needs to be like that, right? Like, so I think it's about thinking hard about what is it that you're doing? Why are you doing it? If you're doing something that is super complicated and you've spent all this time designing your own treble clef, I don't know that that's necessary. We already have a treble clef that works just fine. So it's just like thinking about why, right? Like it being cool is cool, but it being cool isn't necessarily enough. Is it communicative is really important, I think. That was a long answer, but yeah.
Thank you for all of you guys' answers on that. It was a great little journey. I appreciate that. And I'm sure a lot of the composers do too. Well, yeah, thank you so much for everything you shared. Did anybody else have any more questions, or you guys have any more points you would like to share about?
No, come hang out with us at 4:30.
And make sure you stand up and walk around. We don't want anyone getting the Zoom deep vein thrombosis.
It's one of the more dangerous thrombosi. Okay, so we'll see y'all.
Guys.
We'll see y'all very soon.
See you soon, friends.
Bye.